As listeners, you can tell that Gray and I are absolutely superb orators, historical elucidators of the highest sort. That's why you tune in to learn all about Toronto history, but what if you could hear these wonderful, mellifluous voices in person? Well, that's right. The hosts of Muddy York are available for personal speaking engagements, or, I suppose, professional speaking engagements. Don't want to get too personal. If you'd like to have us address your organization about any of the topics we covered in one of our episodes, please let us know at muddy_york@outlook.com, and we'll see what we can do. Might even have to come up with a name for this, the Muddy York Speaking Bureau, or the Muddy York Historical Oration Society. We'll come up with something. Anyways, we hope to hear from you.
Hi guys, just a quick note that this episode features graphic depictions of executions. Listener discretion is advised.
December 11th, 1962, Toronto. You've worked the Don Jail for 11 years. You know every sound this building makes. The way the rotunda carries a voice from the third tier all the way to the main floor. The particular clang of the cell block doors on the east wing versus the west. The pipes that start up at 4 in the morning like the building is clearing its throat. You know which inmates sleep light and which ones sleep through anything. You know which guards cut corners on the overnight rounds and which ones don't. After 11 years inside these walls, you know this place the way you know your own house in the dark. Which is why tonight is different. You were told 3 days ago, in a room with no windows by a man who didn't look you in the eye when he explained it. The paperwork has been filed. The procedure has been reviewed. Everyone who needs to know knows. And now, it's just a matter of walking down a corridor you've walked 1,000 times and doing something you have never done before and will never do again. The room is small, a converted washroom. That's what the records still call it. Nobody calls it that anymore. It's just the room behind the door that stays locked. 2 ropes hang from the beam above the trapdoor. The hangman, a man you know only as Jack Ellis, a pseudonym that protects his identity and his family, who have no idea what he does for a living, stand to one side checking his calculations one last time. He goes to church each Sunday. He believes strongly in what he does. He has done this 15 times before. He has measured the drop against sandbags weighted to match each man exactly. He believes he has it right. 2 men are brought in. Arthur Lucas, Ronald Turpin. Before the hoods go on, someone says it, that they'll probably be the last men ever hanged in Canada. The room goes quiet, waiting to see how that lands. Lucas looks at the floor. Turpin stares straight ahead. Then he says it. 3 words, flat and dry, like a man who stopped being surprised a long time ago. Some consolation. The Salvation Army chaplain, Cyril Everett, reads from the 23rd Psalm as their legs are bound at the ankles and the knees. Their hands are tied behind their backs. You stand where you're told to stand. You do not look at their faces. You haven't looked at their faces since they walked in. White hoods are placed over their heads. Lucas and Turpin stand back to back on the same trapdoor, a noose fitted around each of their necks. Jack Ellis springs the trap. Turpin's neck breaks cleanly. The doctor moves toward him immediately. Then the doctor stops. He turns to Ellis, says something you can't hear from where you're standing. Ellis goes still. The doctor says it again, louder this time, and the words reach you across the room, and you wish they hadn't. The calculations were wrong. Arthur Lucas was heavier than the sandbags. The drop was too long, his head nearly torn right off, hanging by the sinews of his neck. Blood on the floor beneath him. The chaplain, who has been with these men for 10 months, who read them psalms and held their hands, and believed with everything he had that at least one of them was innocent, makes a sound you will never forget and turns away. You don't turn away. You were told not to. You file the paperwork before 2 a.m. You stand in the staff room afterwards with a cup of coffee going cold in your hand. Nobody speaks. Nobody is going to. You have worked the Don Jail for 11 years. You will work here for 9 more. And in all that time, across all those years, you will never once go back down that corridor. You will take the long way around every single shift. You will add 4 minutes to every round for the rest of your career, rather than walk past that door again.
Adam, I've got another question for you. Did you sleep after we recorded part 1?
Like a baby. A baby who kept waking up thinking about execution chambers and converted washrooms, but a baby all the same.
What, are you saying you woke up every 2 hours with wet pants and you needed some warm milk? Because I also did not get the best sleep after that episode.
Which is something I'd like to address, actually. Because part 1 was a bit of a tease, wasn't it? We spent an entire episode talking about a jail, how it was built, why it failed, who was inside it, and then right at the end you drop 34 men and a locked room and just leave. No executions, no Lucas and Turpin, nothing. Just a cliffhanger and see you next week.
That was the plan.
It was a good plan. I was annoyed by it, but it was still a good plan.
Everything that was missing from part 1 is in this episode. The executions, the Boyd gang, Lucas and Turpin, the full story of what happened in that room on December 11th, 1962. All of it.
And if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, go back. Listen to that one first. We'll still be here. We are always here. We are eternal. We are existential. We are beyond your understanding.
Okay, Adam. So we've had a couple good episodes, a lot of listens, some great feedback, and suddenly you think we're all that. Well, I kind of do too. Well, okay, so for everybody that did listen to part 1, buckle up. This episode covers some genuinely difficult territory, the details of capital punishment, a botched execution, questions about wrongful conviction. We're going to handle all of it with the care it deserves, but we want you to know that going in, some of what we're about to discuss is disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
That's the most serious I've ever heard you sound.
It's a serious episode.
It really is.
I'm Grayson Miller.
And I'm Adam Weiser.
And this?
And this is Muddy York.
Is Muddy York. You may remember from part 1, we ended on a number. 34 men, 1 room. A converted washroom in the northeast corner of the building behind a door that stayed locked. Before we get to who these men were and what happened to them, we need to understand how that room came to exist in the first place. Because the Don Jail was not built as a place of execution. When it opened in 1864, the whole point was reform. Environment shaping behavior. People leaving better than they arrived. But the law was the law. Certain crimes demanded that justice be carried out in one way. So, in the early years, they built a scaffold in the yard, outside in the open air, and Toronto came to watch. At the hanging of Fred Lee Rice in July 1902, crowds had lined the surrounding rooftops just to get a view of the spectacle. People climbed trees, craned their necks over the jail walls, pushed as close as they could get. Public executions in the Don jail yard had become a spectacle, and the authorities had seen enough of it. The killing wasn't the problem, the audience was. So, starting with the execution of John Boyd in January 1908, all hangings at the Don jail moved indoors to a converted washroom in the northeast corner of the building. The indoor facility was seen as an improvement because the condemned didn't have as far to walk. This is actually the reasoning they used, to save the prisoners time on their march to death. Moving it inside put it 20 meters closer to the cells, 200 people sleeping on the other side of those walls on any given night. The sound of those boots in the corridor, the heavy door, the silence that followed. Every prisoner in the building felt it, even if nobody talked about it. The state called it more humane. The people inside the building knew the difference.
And here's the detail that stopped me completely when I found it during our research. The first man executed at the Don jail wasn't some anonymous figure from the margins of the city. His name was George Bennett, and before he was a condemned man, he was an employee of the Globe newspaper, the very paper whose founder, George Brown, we talked about in part 1. This is the man who wrote that the Irish immigrants filled Toronto's poorhouses and prisons and were lazy, improvident, and unthankful. The man whose words we use to explain exactly why the Don jail failed the people it was supposed to reform. Bennett was a disgruntled former Globe employee who confronted and shot the paper's founder, George Brown, who was also a father of Confederation, in 1880. The wound was expected to heal. It became infected, and George Brown died. Bennett was sentenced after a one-day trial and hung at the Don jail on July 23, 1880. The man who spent years dismissing the people inside the Don jail as defective and criminal was killed by one of them. Now, the state had a very specific answer to the question of who actually carried out these executions. And the answer tells you everything about how Canada wanted to think about what it was doing. The hangman had a name, Jack Ellis, except that wasn't his real name. Jack Ellis was a pseudonym used to protect the identity of the hangman and his family, who were completely ignorant of his occupation. He went to church every Sunday. He came home to a family who thought he did something else for a living. He collected $500 per execution from the York County Sheriff's Office and then disappeared back into his ordinary life. But here's what makes it stranger. The Ellis name was a tradition passed down through Canada's hangmans for decades. The original Ellis was a British man named Arthur English who conducted more than 600 executions. When he died, the name passed on to whoever came next. Each hangman inherited the pseudonym like a uniform. The state needed someone to do the job and needed nobody to know who that someone was. The Ellis name solved both problems at once. In 1976, Jack Ellis agreed to one interview. He sat down with CBC reporter Paul Soles wearing a black hood with slits cut out of his eyes to hide his face. When Soles asked him how he would feel if capital punishment was abolished and there was no longer a need for a hangman, Ellis replied without hesitation, "Well, I feel that I've served the country in the best way I know how. I've met the requirements that the country required, I've done my job, and I'm retired." A man in a black hood, talking about retirement like he ran a dry cleaning business. His family still had no idea who he was or what he had done. His neighbors had no idea. The only people in Canada who knew his real name were a handful of sheriffs and government officials sworn to keep it that way. That's the system that walked 34 men into that room in the Don jail.
But before we get to the last men walked into that room, we need to talk about something else the Don jail became known for. Something that had nothing to do with execution and everything to do with the fact that the building the city had built to keep people locked up was failing at the main thing it was trying to do, keeping people locked up. In 1949, a man named Edwin Alonzo Boyd, Canada's answer to John Dillinger, walked into a Toronto branch of the Bank of Montreal wearing a disguise, jumped the counter, and walked out with $3,000. He was drunk. It was his first but not his last bank robbery, and he was so unrecognizable in his disguise that a few days later, he walked back into the same bank and changed to 20 without anybody recognizing him. He robbed 6 more banks before he was caught and wound up in the Don jail. And it was there, sitting in his cell, that he met the men who would make him famous. Lenny Jackson was a hairdresser from Niagara Falls who had lost a foot in a railway accident and had a wooden prosthetic. Willie Jackson, no relation, was a career criminal who had been given the nickname the Clown. Together with Boyd, they hatched an escape plan. The method was straightforward. Lenny Jackson had hidden hacksaw blades inside his prosthetic leg, which is impressive even if he is using a prosthetic leg. I'm mildly curious as to how he managed to do that. They used these blades to cut the bars on their cell, and on November 4th, 1951, all 3 men went over the wall and disappeared into the city. What followed was a string of bank robberies that made them the most wanted men in Canada. In 4 months, they robbed 4 banks for a total of $75,000. Remember, that's $75,000 in 1950s money. They were eventually caught and brought back to the Don jail and placed in cells right next to each other. What could possibly go wrong with that plan? They escaped again. Willie Jackson grabbed a key from a guard as a joke, offering to lock him in his cell. While holding the key, he squeezed it tightly into his palm, which left an impression that he traced out. With a hacksaw blade smuggled in by a lawyer and a piece of blank metal, Boyd fashioned a working key that opened all 4 cells. Every day for 30 minutes, while guards supervised prison transfers elsewhere, the 4 men let themselves out of their cells and sawed through the bars at the end of the cell block. On the night of September 7th, 1952, they crawled through the window, walked along the ledge, climbed down the outside wall, and ran for the Don Valley. A police officer had been standing directly below them the entire time. He had stepped away to get a coffee just before they came down the wall. That night, the CBC reported the escape on its very first newscast. Incidentally, the anchor was Lorne Greene, who older Canadians will remember as Ben Cartwright on Bonanza. The jail's warden was suspended, and a $26,000 reward was offered for information leading to their arrest. Now, think about that for a second. The Don Jail, the building that was supposed to be the most controlled, most ordered, most deliberately designed correctional facility in North America, had just become the subject of Canada's first ever television news report because bank robbers had walked away from it twice.
The Boyd gang escape exposed something the Don jail had been hiding for years. A building that presented order on the outside was rotting on the inside. The bars that were supposed to hold people in could be cut with blades hidden in a wooden foot. The keys that were supposed to keep the cells locked could be copied from a palm print. The guards who were supposed to be watching were stepping away for coffee. 10 days after the second escape, all members of the gang except Boyd were found hiding in a barn in the Don Valley less than a mile away from the jail they had just broken out of. Boyd was arrested separately, asleep in a flat on Heath Street. Lenny Jackson and Steve Sucken were tried for the murder of Detective Sergeant Edmund Tong, who had been shot during a police stop months earlier. Both were convicted and hung at the Don jail in December 1952. Edwin Boyd received 8 life sentences plus 27 years. He was paroled in 1962. He moved to British Columbia, changed his name to John, got a job driving a bus for people with disabilities. He fell in love with a passenger, took care of her for the rest of his life. Edwin Alonzo Boyd died in 2002 at the age of 88. 2 months before he died, he told a CBC reporter that before he became a bank robber, he had killed 2 people and left their bodies in the trunk of a car in Hyde Park. The Don jail produced a lot of stories. Not many of them ended that cleanly. Now we get to the 2 men we first met in part 1. The 2 men where this whole episode has been building towards. Arthur Lucas and Ronald Turpin had almost nothing in common. They came from different places,
committed different crimes, and arrived at the Don jail through completely separate paths. What they shared was a lawyer, a death row corridor, a last meal eaten with spoons because knives were considered weapons, and eventually the same trap door. Ronald Turpin was 29 years old. He was born in Ottawa in 1933. His parents had separated before he was born and divorced when he was 2. His mother was an alcoholic who had placed him in the care of various relatives from an early age, several of whom sexually abused him. By the age of 11, he was in foster care. As a teenager, he was sent to the reformatory for petty theft. By his mid-20s, he had served jail time in both Canada and the United States for auto theft, mail theft, and evading custody. He was by any measure a man the system had been failing since the first day he was born. In the early mornings of February 12, 1962, Turpin was driving a battered 1954 Pontiac truck returning from robbing a restaurant on Kingston Road in Scarborough. Toronto police officer Frederick Nash pulled him over near Danforth and Dawes Road for a broken taillight. Nash recognized Turpin from a previous bulletin. An exchange of gunfire followed. Nash died. Turpin was arrested shortly after. Arthur Lucas was 54 years old. He came from Georgia, had spent most of his adult life in Detroit, and had a record that included pimping and drug charges. He was convicted of the murder
Of Thurland Crater, a police informant, and Crater's girlfriend.
both killed in a rooming house on Kendall Street in Toronto. Lucas maintained his innocence from the moment he was arrested to the moment he walked into the room on Gerrard Street. The lawyer who represented both of them was Ross McKay. He was 29 years old. He had no financing for either defense. He had 19 days between the two trials. He tried to do his best. Supposedly, he showed up to the courtroom, sometimes drunk and hungover. Obviously, this wasn't enough. Both men were convicted. Both were sentenced to death. McKay had nightmares about them for years afterwards. In the 1970s, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. His efforts to self-medicate with alcohol deepened the disease's impact. Lucas and Turpin's cases followed him for the rest of his life.
On December 10th, 1962, the cabinet met and declined to commute the sentences. There would be no reprieve. That afternoon, Lucas and Turpin were told. A few hours before his execution, Turpin wrote a note to someone who had once wronged him. "I know you did me wrong," he wrote, "but I can't go into eternity with feelings of resentment on my soul." That evening, Lucas and Turpin ate their last meal, a steak each, with spoons. In corridor H9, also known as Death Row, table knives and forks were considered weapons. Chaplain Cyril Everett joined them at the meal, also using a spoon for his steak. His choice of implement came out of solidarity. He had been spending part of every day in the men's company since they arrived on death row, and over those months, he had said prayers with them, talked sports, played checkers. Lucas was apparently an ace at the game. Just before midnight, the official hanging party assembled in the corridor outside the cells. 9 men in total, including the jail's physician. Wasting no time, the party walked a brisk 25 yards through 3 doors to the corridor that served as the gallows room. Outside the jail on Gerrard Street, a crowd of demonstrators had been picketing in the cutting wind and freezing temperatures for hours. When jail officials posted a notice of the hangings at 12:30 a.m., the crowd surged forward shouting. Police called for motorcycle backup, and there were arrests before the crowd finally dispersed. Lucas had requested that his favorite psalm, Psalm 35, be read to him. "Let them be ashamed and brought to confusion together that rejoice at mine hurt." At 2 minutes after midnight, Jack Ellis pulled the lever. The 2 men dropped 6 feet. Turpin's neck broke cleanly. Lucas's did not. They were declared dead at 12:18 a.m. Their bodies were removed from the jail through a side door and placed in unmarked graves in Prospect Cemetery. Lucas and Turpin were numbers 709 and 710 in Canada's history of executions. The country never carried out another one. Here is where the story gets harder. Because Ronald Turpin shot Frederick Nash, there were witnesses, and he never denied it. His defense was fear and self-preservation, not innocence. Whatever you think about whether he deserved to die for what he did, the facts of what happened on Danforth and Dawes Road that February morning are not in serious dispute. Arthur Lucas is a different story entirely. Lucas had an IQ of 63. The U.S. Bureau of Prisons had previously described him as unsalvageable. He maintained his innocence to the end, but conceded that his misspent life of crime was likely to have ended badly anyway. His lawyer, Ross McKay, 29 years old with no budget and 19 days between two capital murder trials, built a defense around the idea that Lucas had been set up. The theory was this: Thurland Crater, the man Lucas was convicted of killing, was a witness in a drug trafficking case against a Detroit crime figure named Gus Sanders. Crater had been hiding in a Toronto rooming house on Kendall Street. The only person Saunders knew who was still in contact with Crater was Lucas. So Saunders had Lucas followed to Kendall Street, waited until Lucas left, then sent in his own men to do the killing. Lucas led them to the address, then left. Then two people were murdered, and Lucas was the one who went to the gallows for it. The appeal lawyer, Walter Williston, visited Lucas on the last day. Lucas looked at him and said, "When a man thinks he has been tricked out of his life, it's hard." Nobody ever proved Lucas was innocent. Nobody ever proved he was guilty beyond what the original trial established. What we know is that he had an inadequate defense, that the key prosecution witnesses had extensive criminal records, that the man who arguably had the strongest motive for the murders was convicted of the underlying drug trafficking charge in a separate trial that same year, and that Canada executed Arthur Lucas anyway.
The question of Lucas's innocence became one of the central arguments in Canada's abolition debate in the years that followed. Between 1956 and 1966, 4 Canadian journalists played a role in driving the wrongful conviction argument into the public consciousness. Their investigative work cast doubt on the criminal convictions of 3 people who had all been sentenced to hang. The argument was simple and devastating. The death penalty is irreversible. If you get it wrong, there is no correcting it, and we had just gotten it possibly wrong with the very last person we ever executed. Capital punishment for murder was officially removed from Canada's criminal code in 1976. The debate that led there ran directly through what happened on that room inside the Don jail on December 11, 1962. Chaplain Cyril Everett visited the unmarked graves of Lucas and Turpin once a year for the rest of his life. Shortly before he died in 1986, he said, "To this day, I don't believe it pleased the Almighty God." He had been the last person to speak with both of them as human beings rather than as condemned men. He spent the rest of his living life with what he had witnessed in that room. The chaplain, who stood there in that room, watched them get hung, he read the Psalms and spoke to them, believed at least one of those men should not have been there. The state disagreed, and the state got the last word. After 1962, the Don jail kept going. No more executions. Capital punishment was effectively over in Canada, even if it wasn't officially abolished for another 14 years. But the building was still full, still overcrowded, still being asked to hold far more than it was ever designed to contain. By the 1960s and 70s, the conditions had become so bad that even for the time it was considered absolutely horrible. Cells built for one person regularly held 2 or 3. The rated capacity of the East Wing was 276. The average prisoner load was 620. And if you ever go and actually see the cells, it's crazy to think that 3 people would be inside there. There were no showers for most of the jail's history, no phones for inmates, no proper facilities for meeting with lawyers. Prisoners on remand, people who had not been convicted for anything, sat in those conditions for months, waiting for their cases to be heard. Judges began giving prisoners 3 days credit for every 1 day served in the Don jail, because the conditions were so far below any acceptable standard that the courts felt they had no choice but to acknowledge it. The building that opened as the most progressive correctional facility in North America was being used as a sentencing discount because everyone in the justice system knew it was a disgrace. When it finally closed in 1977, there was a photograph taken of dignitaries taking a whack at the building with a sledgehammer. Gary Maidema, chief historian of Heritage Toronto, described it as a place of fear and cruelty in the popular imagination and said the closure was considered a victory for humanity.
The East Wing stayed open as the Toronto Jail until 2013. A modernist addition built in 1958 that had none of the architectural ambition of the original building and all of the same problems. By the end of its service, its rated capacity was 550, and its average prisoner load was about 620. The original building sat empty for decades after 1977. 36 years between closure and restoration. The city that had celebrated its closure with dignitaries and sledgehammers now had a 150-year-old heritage building on Gerrard Street that nobody quite knew what to do with. So it became a storage facility. Government equipment, old records, the rotunda that William Thomas designed to project civic authority and moral order became a place to stack boxes. And then Hollywood came calling. In 1988, the rotunda became the set of the Cell Block nightclub in the movie Cocktail. Tom Cruise tended bar and tossed bottles in the air in the same space where prisoners had been processed, held, and walked to their deaths. The filmmakers knew exactly what they were working with. They, after all, called the bar the Cell Block. They leaned into it. Orphan Black shot scenes there too, using the building's naturally unsettling atmosphere for a fictional institute. Over the years, the Don Jail became one of Toronto's most reliable film locations, precisely because it looked like what it was. A place where dark things had happened and the walls still remembered. In 2007, workers renovating the Don Jail made a discovery that nobody had been looking for. Buried beneath the exercise yard, the ground that prisoners had walked on every single day for fresh air, were the skeletal remains of 15 men. Executed at the Don Jail between 1872 and 1930 and buried right there, under the yard. The exercise yard, the part of the building that was supposed to represent the reform philosophy more than anything else. Fresh air, movement, dignity. The one concession the Don Jail made to the idea that prisoners deserved something beyond four stone walls. And the whole time underneath it were the men the building had killed. Experts from the Archaeological Services painstakingly identified all 15 men. Among them was George Bennett, the disgruntled Globe employee who shot George Brown in 1880. The fine three-piece suit he wore to the gallows was still on his bones. In December 2008, all 15 men were reburied in an unmarked grave in a remote corner of St. James Cemetery, deep in the Rosedale Valley. An Anglican priest conducted the ceremony. Nearby graves have tombstones, and some have fresh flowers. There is no stone on this spot.
The archaeologist who led the excavation, Ron Williamson, said he does not have a problem with the unmarked grave. His reasoning was that these men were convicted criminals and that the city had given them a proper reburial, and that was enough. Maybe, but there's something worth sitting with in the fact that the men the Don Jail executed ended up in two unmarked graves. The first beneath a yard that the prisoners walked on for exercise for decades without knowing. The second in a corner of a cemetery that most people in the city have never visited and never will. The building that was supposed to change people, that was supposed to reform them, that ended up executing 34 of them, eventually got converted into a hospital administration building. Toronto is very good at moving on. In 2012, Bridgepoint Health commissioned a restoration of the original Don Jail building. The architects removed what they described as 150 years worth of grime from the exterior. They preserved about 20% of the heritage interior. the rotunda, the griffin brackets, the original iron railings. The punishment and death row cells were preserved. The former gallows tower was preserved, with the outline of the timber framing still visible on the interior walls. These spaces remained behind closed doors, except on special occasions like Doors Open Toronto. When it reopened in April 2013, the building became the administrative headquarters for Bridgepoint Health, providing office space for about 100 hospital administrators. The public is free to explore the main floor rotunda and some of the prison cells during regular office hours. Walk through the south entrance today and you pass under Father Time, the same carved figure that gazed down at every prisoner who entered this building, stern and hard-looking, quite in character for a prison house. Still there, still watching. The cells on the lower level are open for self-guided tours. You can stand in one, feel the width of it, 86 centimeters, narrower than a doorway, one person, one cot, one bucket. The jail cells are now used for private offices for hospital staff. When prisoners once sat in the dark with a bucket, hospital administrators now sit with laptops and coffee cups and views of the Don Valley.
The street outside has been renamed. The former Don Jail roadway is now called Jack Layton Way, after the late leader of the NDP and former member of parliament for this area. The grounds around the building are being landscaped into a park named Hubbard Park, after William Peyton Hubbard, one of Toronto's first black politicians and a contemporary of the jail's earliest years. The building that opened in 1864 as a statement about what Toronto believed a jail could do is now surrounded by a hospital, a park named after a black civic leader, and a street named after a politician who spent his career fighting for the people the Don Jail spent a century failing. There is something almost too neat about that. The kind of resolution that real history rarely produces, but occasionally manages anyway. The griffin brackets are still on the balconies, the outline of the gallows timber is still on the wall, the grave in the corner of St. James Cemetery is still unmarked, and somewhere in the building is an office that used to be a cell. Someone is eating lunch and looking out at the Don River and has no idea what happened in the room 20 meters away from them. The Don Jail has always been good at keeping its secrets.
So, what does the Don Jail mean to Toronto? It means that this city, the one we live in now, was built by people who genuinely believed they could engineer better human beings through the right kind of architecture. That if you gave someone light and air and structure and purpose, you could send them back into the world improved. It was an optimistic idea. It was also wrong, or at least incomplete, in ways that become almost immediately clear and never really got addressed. It means that the gap between what a city says it believes and what it actually does has always been wider than we'd like to admit. The Don Jail believed in reform. It practiced containment. It promised dignity. It delivered a bucket on the floor and 3 people in a cell built for one. It means that the people who ended up inside those walls, the Irish immigrants and the addicts and the teenagers and the men on death row, were not abstractions. They were the direct consequences of the city that surrounded the building. The Don Jail didn't create poverty or addiction or desperation. It just absorbed all of it and called it justice.
And it means that Ronald Turpin and Arthur Lucas, the 2 men the Crown decided it was finished with on December 11, 1962, are buried in an unmarked grave in Prospect Cemetery, while the building where they died is now a hospital administration center that anyone can walk into on a Monday morning. The Don Jail was built to change people. As a hospital, it heals people. As an administration building, it serves the people who do that healing. For the first time in its history, the building is doing exactly what it was designed to do in 1864. Whether the city that built it, that filled it beyond capacity, that looked the other way for a century, has learned the same lesson, is a question Toronto is still answering.
I'm Grayson Miller.
And I'm Adam Weiser, and this is Muddy York.
Guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at muddy_outlook that's muddy_york@outlook.com. We're also on social media. You can find us at Muddy York Podcast. There's 2 Y's in the middle. Guys, please like and share this podcast if you enjoyed it. This is how people find out about it. We're trying to grow. We're trying to tell more great Toronto stories. So if you can like and share it and tell a friend, pass it along, give us 5 stars, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for listening. We love hearing all of your stories and the stuff that you share with us on the socials. So keep doing it. We love you guys. Thank you so much.